Hello and welcome to the Tent Weavers. I'm Rabbi Michael Gilboa. I'm here with my co-host, Rabbi Juan Mejia and Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz, and it is really wonderful to be back. I want to apologize for being gone for so long. Some of you may know that in the past 6 months, a lot has changed for me. I have started a new position as a congregational rabbi in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan. So I had to move with my family, start a new job, continue with the old job as well. I'm still doing the online Intro to Judaism program, The Footpath. And, we all kind of thought the pandemic might be over at some point, and it's not. And so it's just been a very busy time. And sometimes things end up on the back burner. And this podcast is one of those things, but I'm very glad that we're back now, and it's been a busy 6 months for me. And I'd love to hear a little bit from my co-hosts about what have you been up to since our audience last saw you.
Continuing with my congregation, trying to get through Delta. We had our high holidays. And I just completed one cycle of my Introduction to Judaism program, which is awesome. And I'm looking forward to launching a new one. So I'm, guiding a number of individuals through that process, which is really gratifying. And just, the wheeling and dealing of congregational life and family life. And life isn't terribly exciting during the pandemic. It's actually really boring to be in a global crisis. So there you go.
There you go. Yeah. What about you, Juan? I know you got home to Colombia at some point.
I managed to squeeze between Delta and Omicron, and I went to Barranquilla, finally finalized 19 conversions that were on hold since 2020, and did the weddings and the B'nai Mitzvah, and the community now there has been strengthened. And we had some press coverage, which I hope will be out soon, and everybody will get to see beautiful pictures of new people creating new Judaism for themselves in the Caribbean. So that is wonderful.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Wonderful. So sometimes we talk about conversion in the news or conversion in pop culture, and that's actually what inspired us to get the crew back together. There has been an instance of conversion in popular culture. Eric Cartman from the show South Park.
Huge.
Yeah, no, this is huge. This is a big one. So for those of you who don't follow the show is about the adventures and misadventures of a group of fourth graders. I guess it was sort of sunsetted or canceled or whatever term you want to use. Except now that they've brought it back, except they have moved everyone forward in time. It's an indefinite point in the future, and they're doing these specials on the new streaming service they have. So it's an indefinite point. The kids are now around about my age. They're middle aged. They've got kids of their own, and in the world of the show. We've been dealing with COVID this whole time. So 40 some years we've been dealing with COVID. It's almost over, but not quite. And they've all had to come back together because their friend Kenny has died. The joke, of course, being yeah, I know, right. The joke being that Kenny dies in every episode, or nearly every episode. But now Kenny has died, and it might have something to do with COVID. It might have something to do with the end of COVID. And so they've come back together for Kenny's funeral. And it turns out that in the meantime, Cartman has converted to Judaism. He has become a rabbi. He has a Jewish wife. He has 3 Jewish kids. Demographically, it lines up pretty nicely with my life, actually, which was a little disturbing to see on screen. And so for those who haven't been following, for years, Cartman has been tormenting his Jewish friend Kyle with basically anti-Semitic statements, slurs, taunts. In the later seasons, it kind of went a little more intense. He dressed up as Hitler and staged a pogrom. Got the primordial monster Cthulhu to destroy synagogues. It all is anti-Semitic to the point of I mean, it all seemed fairly like in scale for children in the earlier seasons, and by the time you get to the later seasons, it's all gone very, very extreme, to the point where it sort of stopped being funny for me. Other people might have a difference of opinion, but now it's entirely possible that this is all still a joke, that this is all still somehow Cartman trying to pull one over on Kyle. In the world of South Park, I suppose you can imagine someone converting to another religion, going through rabbinical school, having a wife, having children, all living a Jewish life as a prank, as a joke for culminating in a big gotcha moment. And there is going to be a part 2 to this special, which comes out, I think, next week. So we might have to come back with another episode to address whatever's going to happen next. But in the meantime, what do people think about one of the television world's most notorious anti-Semites converting to Judaism and becoming a rabbi?
Well, I think there is precedent. I think even though I don't think the creators of South Park are Jewish, are they?
One of them is, if I remember correctly.
Okay, but it's a very old Jewish joke. We have in the Tanakh, we have instances of generals that are sent to attack us, that I think they meet with the prophet Elisha, and Elisha cures them of their leprosy, and then they don't convert. Conversion does not yet exist in the Tanakh as we know it, but they become Jewishly involved. And in the Talmud, we have the notions that the descendants, for example, of Haman, that there were some Amalekites that were left, and they converted to Judaism, and they taught Torah in Jerusalem. And there is a legend that there's a tradition in the Yerushalmi that claims that this is speaking of none else than Rabbi Akiva. We know that Rabbi Akiva's father Joseph was a convert, and the Talmud puts it together. He was not only a convert, he was an Amalekite convert. So it is. I don't know how it will end. I don't know what the punchline is, but I think that our tradition certainly has the great faith that the beauty of Torah can even turn our enemies into us. It's not just turn our enemies into friends. It's the transformational power of Torah can turn Amalek and make him into Rabbi Akiva. So, and I'm not a big South Park fan. I think I saw the first season. It's been around for a long time. I think the joke is that some people that started watching it when they were in 4th grade are now our age.
Right.
We are South Park, right? Our generation.
Oi.
You know what t-shirt I bought myself for Hanukkah? This is really sad when you buy yourself Hanukkah gifts. It says geriatric millennial. Mike, this is going to mean something to you, but I got it at Raygun.
Ah, very nice. Very nice.
But yes, I do think there's this generational component to it for those of us who are in our late 30s, early 40s, that we kind of grew up with The Simpsons and South Park as these controversial, perhaps, cultural icons. I actually have a devar acher, Juan, on this reading, and I'm not sure I completely agree with it myself. It's great when you can have a machloket with yourself, a disagreement with yourself, but I want to offer it anyway, that this notion of our enemies converting to Judaism, yes, in kind of a grace-filled reading, you could say that, the Shekhinah, bringing them under the wings of the Shekhinah, is such a transformative experience, and that our Torah is healing of their hatred. I mean, I really want to believe that too. But the Devar Acher, the other perspective I want to offer is that this is actually, a revenge fantasy of our textual tradition and our people, perhaps, that what better way to sublimate and subjugate our enemies, not through not through power, not through might, but through my spirit, right? That we sublimate that hatred by making them play on Team Torah, so to say. So I'm wondering whether there is an aspect of kind of revenge fantasy going on in this trope of our enemies joining us, and whether it is just very emotionally satisfying, at least in the abstract, to see that.
Like even when it's plainly like the Talmud claims that Nero converted to Judaism, and that he was an ancestor of Rabbi Meir. There's ideas that Onkelos himself was descended from like Roman nobility, and yet Nero did not convert to Judaism. Poppaea might have dabbled in Judaism, his wife, but yeah, I also see it as like the tools of a powerless people is to say that you hate us so much, you have so much power over us, and yet out of your own free will, you decide to come over to our team.
It's an interesting approach too, because we're not. This isn't an unknown genre. Many scholars think the Book of Joshua, for instance, is essentially a revenge fantasy written after the Babylonian exile, or maybe during the Babylonian exile. Oh, wouldn't it have been great if our armies had gone through and wiped out all of the Canaanites? That's fun. It's a fun read when you're a powerless people. But it's the it's the genius and the beauty of rabbinic Judaism to say, well, what's our revenge fantasy? It's not that we wipe them all out, is that they converted to Judaism. I mean, that's a very different sort of revenge.
It's much better.
Right.
These like as far as revenge fantasies go, Nero converting to Judaism and fathering sages is far more innocuous than and we'll go and like crush the kind of these apocalyptic, because this is all part of apocalyptic literature, mm-hmm. which we also dabbled in. It didn't become part of our rabbinic corpus. It remained as part of the apocrypha, the pseudepigrapha, but we also had a tradition of we shall rise triumphant, and in a very military way we are going to overcome our enemies. I think this power fantasy still plays very deeply into like fundamentalist readings of the idea of the Messiah.
I want to bring those two ideas together, and also something I have been struggling with during Hanukkah. So you could actually argue that this revenge fantasy of our enemies becoming us, essentially, is the other side of the coin of something that luckily doesn't get a lot of historical airtime in Judaism, but basically coercive conversion. It's a different form of coercion. It's a spiritual coercion, not a physical coercion. And the reason I bring it up is because, of course, we just came out of Hanukkah, and I've been studying the book of Maccabees and reading up a little bit on the Hasmoneans and kind of wrestling with this idea of like the Idumeans and some other tribes as well, not just the Idumeans. The Idumeans being forcibly converted, put to the sword and Judaized by the Hasmonean dynasty, which very few people actually know about. It's one of only two, as far as I know, two historical instances where Jews practiced enforced conversion. The other one being a Yemenite king in the 5th century, I believe. But, so I've really kind of grappled with like our inner darkness, the inner darkness of like, we pride ourselves on having such a gentle tradition on conversion, like, okay, some people say Jews don't proselytize. Okay, we'll put that question away. But I think that most Jews, there's a consensus, however you fall on that continuum in the Jewish community on your thinking on conversion, is that Jews never coerce. Right? Some of us might be more proactive about wanting to help people convert. Some of us believe the initiative should entirely rely on the convert. All those positions are fine and authentic to Judaism. But I think the ethos that underscores all those positions is that there's never a coercive element. And the Hasmoneans teach us that, at least historically, at that time there was this coercive element, and while Cartman obviously isn't being put to the sword. I mean, this is a self-motivated decision as far as we can know from the storyline. There is something really violent, something really violent about him doing that and him being compelled to do that. Like this idea that we spiritually subjugate our enemies by making them us has a certain kind of violence and a certain kind of grimness to it that I'm really interested in thinking about.
Well, I mean, what is the internet for if not arguing over things that happened 2,200 years ago? But with that as a preface, I'm not convinced about the Idumeans. Actually, the clearest evidence we have for their forced conversion comes from Josephus, who had lots of axes to grind and was writing for a non-Jewish audience, and Manetho the Egyptian, who was just a straight up anti-Semite. Other texts, other stories we have about what happened with the Idumeans, a lot more nuanced. And in Josephus, we see that when the Jewish rebellion happened, it was the Idumeans who were the most sort of zealous fighters in preserving Jerusalem and the temple. Sort of standing. And again, this might be a literary trope because it's sort of well known in the Tanakh that the Edomites, who are the same as the Idumeans, the Edomites were allies of the Babylonians in the destruction of the first temple. And in fact, most of the soldiers involved in the siege probably weren't all the way from Babylon. They were locals who were hired. So they would have been Edomites. And
By the rivers of Babylon ends with a beautiful
exactly
diss to it's a horrible, gruesome diss to Edom, saying like, you did this to us.
Right. Yes. And so what Josephus might be sort of making a rhetorical point, not so different from what we're doing, that this time around at the destruction of the second temple, the Edomites or Idumeans were the fiercest defenders of Jerusalem. Whether it's true or not, it's hard to say. But yeah, I mean, there is, in all pre-modern societies, religion has a coercive element to it. I think Judaism stands even then as uniquely non-coercive by comparison. But it doesn't mean we need to rest on our laurels either, about some of our darker moments.
No, and the transition is when you go and see like the Hasmonean campaigns, that did not survive. That tradition was opposed by the rabbis. The rabbis did not like the Hasmoneans. Maybe this was one of the reasons that they did not like. We know that the Judaized Edomians were discriminated against. Like one of the big points of Herod was that he wasn't really Jewish. Oh, your father was like this Edomian dude who converted. You're not really Jewish. And when we get all of the story of Hanukkah, the miracle of the cruse of oil and all that stuff, which is 600 years even after the facts, it's all been turned into a far gentler, like these stories in the Talmud about the conversion of our enemies always through persuasion, either of a sage. We have this story of Caesar sending, well, I think it's Augustus, who's sending. Would it be Augustus? No, it would have to be someone later. And Rabbi Meir, just like they're sending guys to spy on the Jews in the Beit Midrash, and they all start converting to Judaism.
Isn't there a similar story with Onkelos?
Yeah, that's the Onkelos story. Yeah,
the Roman legions who approach him, and he ends up converting each legion to Judaism.
Right. He points at the mezuzah, and somehow that convinces them.
I'm gonna try that.
So, Mike, you have some Gemara for us?
Yes, yes. So you have both brought some excellent sources just in conversation on this topic, and I want to bring a couple of sources as well that might inform this question about Eric Cartman, about, is there something so bad? Is there something you could do that's so bad that the Jewish people, the rabbis, would say, you are not allowed to convert to Judaism. You are not allowed to repent of your past deeds and become a convert. This is in the context of a concept that when a person has been sinning for a long time, that God, and then they repent, that God might sort of elevate their soul by having them die at the moment of their repentance, which obviously from our point of view, I don't think any of us would necessarily sign up to that theology, but it is what it is in the Talmud. And so it's in the context of that conversation that we have this example given from the life of Rav Chisda, who says that one time a woman came to me and she confessed to him that the light of her sins was that she conceived her younger son by engaging in intercourse with her older son. And yeah, so, and Rav Chisda said to her, you should prepare your funeral shrouds. Essentially, now that you've repented, you're certain to die because of how terrible your sins were. But the Gemara says, but she did not die. So it's confusing. No one exactly understands what's going on here, what God's motivation is. Now, obviously, this is not about conversion, and you're going to have to forgive me for making a leap in the text that I will be the first to admit that the text isn't necessarily taking us in this direction. But I think I know who this woman is, actually. This is a very famous convert to Judaism. There is a street named after her in Jerusalem. Her tomb is in Jerusalem. This is Queen Helena, or Heleni Hamalka. She was a Persian ruling queen in the time of the Talmud, who converted to Judaism along with her family, along with her husband, along with her children, and many of her family converted along with her. There are many famous stories in the Talmud of how she rescued Jerusalem from a famine. She basically bankrupted her own country to be able to bring enough food to feed Israel during a famine. She was a righteous woman who ended up converting. It was the custom in her land. This was a Zoroastrian country, and they had a custom that the royal family, and only the royal family, engaged in incestuous marriage. This is not uncommon in ancient history. Egyptians did something similar. Right. Yeah, exactly. And you know, they would, I think they called it divine union or something along those lines, and it was thought to be in mimicry of the gods, in mimicry of heaven, where, you know, anyone who's read, you know, Greek mythology or something, they're all related to each other, all the gods, and they're all married to each other. And so the question that the rabbis don't touch with a 10-foot pole is, after she converts to Judaism, what happens to her husband / brother, who also converts?
Husband / son, right?
Right. Yes, because then her son, after her husband dies, her son, two of her sons actually become king. First the older one, and then he dies, and then the younger one, named Munbaz, becomes king. So he is king. She is the dowager queen or queen mother. And are they engaged in this relationship? It's sort of unclear. But here's what we do know from Shabbat 68b. This is the other text I want to bring. And I know this is getting kind of gross for a lot of people. I appreciate that like you're all bearing with me here. This is not exactly fun to talk about, but it is interesting nonetheless from my point of view. So in Shabbat 68b, we have this conversation about Shabbat violation needing to bring a temple sacrifice. In the time of the temple, when you violated Shabbat, you had to bring a chatat, a sacrifice to the temple. What do you call it? Sin offering.
A sin offering.
Let's say I write a letter on Shabbat. Do I have to bring a chatat for every single letter that I write down, every word I write, or is it one act and therefore it needs one chatat? And this question sort of gets expanded into, what about something that I used to do all the time because I didn't know any better?
So
what about
transgression?
Habitual transgression based on ignorance. And the example used is Hager shenit gayer ben hagoyim, the convert who converts among the Gentiles. And there's some question about what this means. What is a convert who converts among the Gentiles? Probably what it means, to at least to some degree, is someone who converts without really knowing what they're getting themselves into. Someone who converts without having gone to an intro to Judaism class like we teach. And so they don't know any better. Maybe they know what Shabbat is. They've heard the term, but they don't know all of the details about how to keep Shabbat. And so years might go by, decades might go by. They have no idea. They weren't supposed to be cooking. They weren't supposed to be lighting fire. No one ever told them. Now, from a rabbinic perspective, this is a major failure. But the question the Talmud is asking is, how many chatats do they have to bring? How many sacrifices do they have to bring? And there's a debate about this between two rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, who we all know, and a guy named Munbaz. And the Maharshal says Munbaz is the son of Queen Helena. Son/wife, maybe, or husband. And so that might be informing this conversation. They were, as the royal family of Persia, they were engaged in an ongoing transgression.
Right.
Maybe they didn't know about.
Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, right? Like that Reish Lakish from his own life drew on a particular expertise around discussions of transgression of some kind. So that's the parallel I'm seeing. He's basically a Reish Lakish.
Reish Lakish, for those at home, was a gladiator or a highwayman. He was one bad Jew. He knew a lot about weapons. Right. He was not a convert, but he knew that you place the AK-47 next to your handgun. He knew the place setting of
wow, gosh, I know nothing about that, nor do I want to.
You are like Rabbi Yochanan.
I'm going to disagree with my esteemed colleague just slightly. I think the jury's still out on whether Reish Lakish was a convert. I think he might have been. I really do. Yeah.
Send me. I would love to talk about that. But so what does Monobazo? So we have Rabbi Akiva, who's the son of a convert, with a convert talking about this. I think it informs the discussion nicely.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And Rabbi Akiva says, basically, you need to write down the list of every transgression you committed and bring a chatat for every single one. So every time you broke Shabbat unknowingly, every time you ate something kosher without knowing what kosher was, every time you did a thing, you got to figure it out. It's on you. And basically, like, come up with your laundry list. That's how many chatats you need to bring. And Munbaz says, no, that's obviously that, like, he doesn't say this, but I think it's implied that you're closing the door on tshuva if you do that, because no one could actually do that. Someone who has been living a sort of semi-Jewish life, not aware of all of the intricacies of Jewish law. I couldn't do this, you know. When I converted, I didn't know all of the finer points of Shabbat. You know, I was like many people, you know, you go to Friday night service, then you go to the movies afterwards, this sort of thing. at a certain point in life, I took on more observance. After my conversion, I took on more. I'd say, even to this day, I still continue to grow in my observance. But there's no way I could, realistically speaking, come up with the laundry list of every single time I did something in ignorance.
Who wins?
Like many cases in the Talmud, it's a little unclear who wins, but Rabbi Akiva wins because he always wins. I mean, that's the way the later codes write it down. But Munbaz, I think, is bringing a really good point nonetheless, which is that the act of ignorance is one act. There is one thing that is sort of stopping you from observing Shabbat, observing Kashrut, whatever it is. And that one thing is your own ignorance of the halacha. And so that ignorance is itself the act. And therefore you only have to bring one chatat.
I have a few thoughts, both in terms of, the distance between the days of Sifrut Chazal, the days of the writings of our rabbis, the Talmud, and in terms of how we actually practice Teshuvah nowadays. If you look at the High Holiday liturgy, at the Yom Kippur liturgy, at the Viduis, the confessionals, the Al Chet Shechatanu Lefanecha passages, it kind of is a laundry list, and it is in the plural to cover all of our bases. And I feel like that might be a good, synthesis between this dialectic, right? Where on the one hand, it recognizes Rabbi Akiva's position that we do have to verbalize each individual transgression, but it also accounts Munbaz's position, which is it's actually impossible for each of us to individually atone for that. So we do that in the collective. The second thought I had is that this really speaks to a theology of depravity in a way, both intentional and unintentional depravity filtered through the lens of culturally specific behavior. I think, when we look at marriage taboos or relationship taboos, I'm going to put on my cultural anthropology kippah, that this is very culturally specific. And I certainly don't want us to mock ancient cultures that practiced differently than we did, including ancient cultures that still have living descendants and small but vibrant communities of practice and theology, like the Zoroastrian community. Shout out to the Zoroastrian community. It's actually a really amazing religion. And, I think there's a lot to be learned from Zoroastrianism. But yeah, so I think it speaks to this theology of depravity, right? Like, how bad does it need to get before we can no longer flip the switch on teshuvah and do teshuvah, right? I think that's the underlying question. And I think it doesn't really matter whether that person is a Baal teshuvah, someone who is born Jewish and returns to Jewish practice, or someone who converts. I think that what makes the conversion question part of this is that, in normative rabbinic thinking, at the moment that you go to the mikveh for your conversion, all your transgressions are forgiven. You're kind of born anew, you get a new slate. The same with your wedding day. There are some key junctures in our lives where a reset like that is possible. So, and I think that kind of brings in with Cartman as well, right? Like, yes, there are a lot of really troubling analogies that we can draw, both historically and contemporaneously, about people who do really depraved things. And I think that marks your discomfort, Mike, with discussing this, because it is icky, because depravity is really icky, no matter what kind of depravity. But how depraved do you need to be before salvation or repentance are no longer possible? I think that's the underlying question.
I want to piggyback on that, Esther, and I think that discomfort is a theological catch-22 that the rabbis had, and I think that they are, on the one hand, they have this very radical new idea of teshuvah, and particularly in a post temple theology, right? Like Rabbi Akiva lived through the destruction of the temple. And I don't like, I know that speaking of Monobazos, which was his Greek name of Mumbas and Helene, the only cavalry that we had in against the Romans was the Adiabenian cavalry. It was the personal guard of Helene and Monbaz that were stationed in Jerusalem for Passover, got sieged by the Romans. They were the only horses we had, and they all died defending the city. So it's just to add more complicated like layers to the thing. While we had Alexandrian Jews fighting for the Romans, that is also something that gets sidestepped. There were Romanized Jews shooting ballistas into Jerusalem, shooting arrows into their brethren.
Pax Romana was really compelling.
The nephew of Philo was there. Berenike, the last Hasmonean queen, was Titus's lover. She was warming up his bed in the tent, like while he was sieging Jerusalem. It's really complicated. But once the rabbis say teshuvah is absolute, or when they say a convert is like a newborn child, ger kekatan shenolad dameh, conversion teshuvah recreate you anew. It's a miracle. It's like you don't have your familial ties. You don't have, like, your mother's not your mother anymore. Your brother's not your brother. You are created anew. It's this power that the individual has. And this is something that I really want to stress, particularly to viewers that are new to Judaism. Rabbis don't convert people, right? Like, there's no three rabbis we gather together and we go, bololo, 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 age of empires, and all of a sudden you're Jewish. No. We are here as witnesses, and you say, I want to join you. And then we say, okay. And like later texts even go like, do rabbis even have the power to say no? Like, if the person is sincere enough that says, I want to follow Torah, I want to do, and does the, which might be one of these issues, a convert that converts among the nations. It's a beautiful idea. It gives humans really divine power. God creates the world out of nothing by speech. We create ourselves anew by speech. And we know that it was a controversial idea because of these texts. And I think there's one that is even more poignant, which is the death story of the sages, where Rabbi Akiva dies. And there is Rabbi Yehoshua ben Teradion. I think this is either in Gittin or in Avodah Zarah. And he's wrapped in a Sefer Torah with sponges of water, and he's thrown into the fire. It's a horrible means of execution because the sponges are delaying the burning. And he is in so much pain. And there's the Kalistoneri. The Kalistoneri is the executioner, and he's just there like watching this poor rabbi die. And the guy says, you guys are really committed. If I turn to your side, will God accept me? And he says, yes. And what he does is he eases the death of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Teradion, and then he jumps into the fire. And then there's several rabbis, and like, there's no more rabbis. I don't know if it's in the scene itself, like rabbis that are watching this, because there's a bat call that says, oh, welcome Rabbi Yehoshua ben Teradion and the executioner. It's deathbed conversion. We had that in Judaism as well, like deathbed. This guy doesn't go, like, he's not circumcised, he doesn't go to the mikveh. He's saying, I believe in this. You've persuaded me. I want to die with you, and I want to die, as it were, as a righteous Gentile, or even as a Jew in progress. And rabbis decry to say, there's one who wins his life, his portion, through a lifetime of work, and there's one who buys it in one moment. Like, then there's, and they are uncomfortable with this idea that I can be horrible my entire life. I can be a Roman executioner, a barbarous tool of empire, and all of a sudden, I turn to God and God receives me. And yet,
when does the generosity of sincere repentance turn into cheap grace?
It's a tough question.
And that is a question. And I think that the rabbis, couldn't bring themselves to say, they say like, this is unfair, but they didn't say it doesn't happen.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, this is one moment where they don't argue with the bot cool.
Right. but they're uncomfortable. And it's like generations later, people are saying, and there's other examples of people who just in a great act of theological inspiration. Right. And we have this in other faith traditions, right? The good thief and the bad thief on the it's an idea that was there in the water of what happens when you do this profound inner transition, which the Greeks called metanoia, changing your mind, changing your nous, changing your intellect, and which we called gior. And I think, Mike, the text about like the convert who converts among the nations is a beautiful parallel, because I think the rabbis were aware of these two things. Gior, that comes from the verb lagur, to inhabit, is the Jew who converts not among the nations. That is the Jew who converts in the blessing of a community, in the blessing of a robust, like if I convert in Tiberias and Rabbi Meir is like teaching my intro to Judaism class, right? And all of a sudden I have all this mimetic information and they're inviting me for Shabbat, and like people are like receiving me. That is gior, right? That is gior. But all gior starts with metanoia, with conversion.
I want to focus this discussion a little bit because I want to close the gap between our ancient text and the modern applied practical rabbinates. Like we see these situations come up all the time, both in terms of actual deathbed conversions. There are rabbis who are confronted, someone in the conversion process, God forbid, suddenly becomes terminally ill, and can't formalize the rituals of conversion, but still wants to convert and die as a Jew, for instance. That is a practical rabbinic question that comes up. The rabbinic question that comes up a lot, especially in the time of the internet, is ger shenit gayer bein hagoyim, the convert who converts among the nations, among the Gentiles, which also raises the question of like, is there such a thing as auto conversion? Can you convert yourself? And how destabilizing would that be to the rabbinic system of, for all intents and purposes, gatekeeping? Even nice rabbis gatekeep, even welcoming rabbis, even convert rabbis like us gatekeep. It is instrumental in our role. I mean, we try to do it warmly and ethically and kindly, hopefully, but there's still an element of gatekeeping in our practical applied rabbinic work. And of course, with the internet, we are going to see that more and more, that people are garim shenit gayer bein hagoyim, right? So like we spread this digital Torah and people hook onto it. And I don't think as a community, we're really thinking through the huge spiritual implications of basically creating the digital version of Ki tetzet Zion, Ki tetzet Torah mitzion, right? Torah shall come out of Zion, out of your Wi-Fi connection. So I think that it applies there too. And the Cartman case applies here too. I mean, obviously he's a polemical character. That's how he's drawn, very intentionally. But what kind of baggage does he have? And would that baggage have been different had he had more exposure to Jews in his South Park universe, for instance? Like, he just has Kyle, as far as I know, and Kyle's family. Like, that's why we have this song, I'm a Jew, a lonely Jew. As
far as I remember, they're pretty observant. Like his parents are observant, but he is not. Like his parents wear a kippah indoors. His mother looks like this, like overbearing Ashkenazi.
That might just be an animator's choice, though, to put the kippah on him. I don't know.
But I think what Esther is bringing is really significant. Like I don't know about self-conversion, and that is definitely a topic that I don't want to touch because, but I will defer to my teacher, Dr. Josh Culp, who's written extensively on that, whether that happened. And even if it happened, I don't know if that it would be advisable today. But
No, I'm not
I
saying
think
that, right?
this debate frames, for me, conversion in the idealized conversionary narrative of orthodoxy and of everybody else. In orthodoxy, and I'm talking about Haredi Judaism, you will not be converted unless you really graft yourself into the community, and your kids go to the same school and you live in the same neighborhood, and you're being naturalized. You're being naturalized in many cases, severing of family ties, which I find extremely difficult and extremely problematic. But that's what the rabbinic tradition actually says. It's like you are no longer related to your family. We might say, well, we might choose to interpret differently, but at least on the literal level of the rabbinic statement, that is what it's saying. And for them to say this is the only way in which giur can happen, is with the grafting of the new person into a community, and it's a community that is not willing to graft everybody. And who is limited, right? If the only way you can become Jewish is by moving to Mea Shearim or to Borough Park, well, that means that only a very tiny sliver of humanity can actually become Jewish, that we're not blessed being Jewish in the first place.
Right.
While
it raises a theological question, which is also at the base of this: what is the purpose of conversion, right? Is the purpose of conversion the spiritual and social integration of a non-Jew into the polity of Israel, the people, not the country? Although in the country, that would also be the country, but in diaspora, that's the people. And is it okay if we say, by virtue of we're pretty globalized as a people, but not every city or town has a Jewish community, and by virtue of our own limitations, that option is not available to everyone, and that's okay. I'm sorry, that's position A. Like, if you don't have a Jewish community in your town, I'm sorry, or even in your country, that's where the buck ends. Sorry, you'll either have to move or give up on your dream, or B, right, which is the more radical and perhaps destabilizing option, which is actually conversion is a mitzvah, and we should be able to offer it and create the conditions regardless of whether those pre-existing conditions are there in that moment. And I just want to caveat that this is real, as a Jew from Europe, as a Jew who has lived and worked in smaller Jewish communities, and Juan, for you as well, and Mike, I think for you as well, we see this all the time. We see the pain and heartbreak of people who are really sincere and who want to become Jewish for all the right ways, but cannot access the community, sufficiently for whatever geographical or other limitations. So, I think it's a question we need to ask ourselves, like, what is our philosophy of conversion? Is that position A or is that position B? And be mindful of like the real life implications this has. I personally know people who are trapped. They want to convert to Judaism. They don't live in a community where they can convert, either because there is no Jewish community or because it's a denomination that will not accept them for who they fundamentally are in some way. And they are stuck, which also brings me to my point of this initial text. As someone who is a member of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, I am like this weird reformative, half reform, half conservative rabbi. Long story. But, like this idea that, a convert who doesn't get it exactly right, has to list all the ways in which the convert should repent as a Jew, or the Jew, right? Who, whether that Jew is through conversion or that Jew is someone who was born Jewish and like grew up pretty assimilated and didn't really have a halachic practice. Like that also really centers the primacy of halakha as a determinant. Now, that's okay from the perspective of our sages, because that was the universe in which they operated. And that's also okay from our contemporaneous denominations that also place halakha at the center. But there are also forms and expressions of Judaism that don't place halakha at the center, and that might answer that question differently. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
I do want to shift gears here a little bit. We're gonna have to wrap it up, but I want to. This has been a great conversation. I also want to point out that, to my knowledge, this is the first time pop culture has seen a convert to Judaism become a rabbi. I could be wrong about that, but for me growing up, it was a watershed moment when I saw Jerry's dentist become Jewish on Seinfeld. And I know for a lot of people, it was Charlotte converting on Sex and the City was what let them know that was an option for them. And then, life imitates art, and we all got to hear about Ivanka Trump during that era. And for many people, this is probably the first time that they've encountered the possibility that some kid they grew up with who wasn't Jewish, not only could they grow up and become Jewish, but they could become a rabbi as well. I've encountered this in my own life. I grew up with friends who were pretty surprised to find out what my spiritual path and career path has been, and I'm sure some of you have as well. But do you think this matters? Do you think I mean, we could be a little trite and say representation matters. Does it matter in this case to see someone on the screen who is converted and becomes a rabbi?
Yeah, of course, we have to acknowledge that this is a problematic character because it's Cartman and he's a reprobate anti-Semite, and
this could all turn out to be a big joke too. I mean, there's that also,
both, right? So like it kind of muddies the waters in terms of storytelling and the emotional strings it pulls in our hearts, But okay, setting that aside, I think there are a lot of mythologies and misconceptions about conversion to Judaism, and even people who know that conversion is a possibility, non-Jews who know that conversion is a possibility, or even some Jews, right, who might not be really grounded in understanding what conversion is as a mechanism in our people. They still might have a mythology. Okay, they can let you in, but then you're kind of a second-rate Jew. You're kind of an off-brand Jew. Like the idea that you can actually penetrate to the heart of Jewish leadership as a convert. I mean, I think that's also a really big conversation to what degree converts are really penetrating the heart of Jewish leadership, and representation, and other minoritized groups as well in our community are truly able to penetrate into the heart of leadership. But for all intents and purposes, Cartman is penetrating the heart of Jewish leadership and taking his position as a Jewish leader. And I think that's really interesting and important. Like, I get a lot of questions when I speak to Christian groups or, interfaith contexts, like, wow, you can convert to Judaism. Okay, so we can deal with that one. But then you can become a rabbi too. Like, I do hear that. So, and I just think it signals acceptance. Like, I think that would I have wanted South Park to be the cultural vehicle through which we promote Jewish outreach? No, that would not have been my first choice. But pop culture, inadvertently or intentionally, can be a vehicle for sharing Jewish ideas and Jewish practice and Jewish communal norms in a really encouraging way. And now, like, okay, we can all like go, ha, 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 it's South Park. But millions of Americans are seeing that you can convert to Judaism and you can become a rabbi, and that might mean something to people who watch that.
Right. I think there is this, because of the tense relationship between the Jewish people and Jewish communities and the West throughout our history. Like this image of Judaism or Jewish communities being this impregnable, hermetic circle of other, racially other, religiously other. That was the status quo for over 16, 18 centuries. Modernity changed that, but it took a while, right? Most movies, most still picture rabbis as male and Hasidic, right? Like when I want to picture a rabbi, I bring someone from this hermetic, self-segregating, or in some cases, segregated from the outside community. Now I think in America is pretty much self-segregated. You poke them out and you place them as the other in the narrative, and they have an accent and they talk like this. But in the past 20 years, and this is a thing that we need to keep hammering, 1 in 6 North American Jews is a convert, right? And I would say that most of us living in the United States and in Europe are like Jews living among the nations, right? Like it's like I wouldn't go half too far to saying as oh, this is like self-conversion. Monbaz and Helene and the king of the Kuzari, there were a couple of Jews who were traders, and there might have even been a rabbi who came and visited him and gave them classes, but they still were doing a Judaism in a society that was not Jewish. And I think that is our diaspora bet, is that we can be Jews among the nations. And it's it's a beautiful favor that South Park is doing. We'll see how it ends. It might be that the joke is on us, but they're showing that yes, your neighbor can become Jewish, and your neighbor can become a rabbi, even if they were not. And I think that is a very important precedent for us. Everyone, I think, left of ultra-Orthodoxy in America, and even there, you've had cases of converts, particularly in Chabad, African-American converts who have been ordained. I don't know how powerful they are as rabbis, how much leadership they're exerting, at what levels, but this is a big wake-up call to say the Jewish community is fluid and Jewish leadership is open towards to people who used to be not Jews. I have not seen the episode. The thing that really I find very interesting is that Cartman is a rabbi, but he's speaking in a church.
He's giving a eulogy for his.
He's giving a eulogy for Kenny, right? But like I don't know if I like Mike. That you saw the episode? Do they show like Rabbi Cartman's B'nai Shalom Breath Ahava synagogue? Or
they mention it. They mention that he's a rabbi in what, Colorado Springs, I think, something like that. So
so he has a congregation, but isn't it like that this guy is coming to honor his non-Jewish friend, right? When was it when the blessing for President Obama, that the one Orthodox rabbi went to the National Cathedral and there was a big hullabaloo within the Orthodox community? Well,
right.
But for people who don't live in that community, for rabbis in Iowa, for rabbis in Detroit, for rabbis in Oklahoma, and even for our colleagues in New York and in LA and Chicago, we live among the nations. We go and we do interfaith work. We like that has nothing to do with conversion. We speak in churches, we speak in Christian universities, we teach. A lot of us have a side gig. Like I used to teach in a Methodist college. I taught Judaism, right? That we are bringing this message, and just by declaring, even such a flawed, horrible person like Eric Cartman could find a rabbi that converted him and a rabbinical school to teach him.
Imagine sitting on that baked in.
I would not want to, but
yeah.
So,
yeah.
you know, on a meta level, I think, not knowing how the episode ends, I think the true prank would be, like the meta prank would be, if Cartman is actually sincere.
Well,
I really hope they go
he
that
certainly
way.
seems sincere. I mean, that could just be part of the joke, but when he speaks about conversion, he speaks about, I was inspired by the message of Torah and inspired to live a Jewish life. He speaks very authentically, and sort of in language that would be, I know this is a controversial topic as well, but it's the kind of language that probably most rabbis would want to hear from their converts. It's that I was inspired by Judaism. I wasn't inspired by circumstance. I wasn't inspired by who I fell in love with. I was inspired by Judaism itself. And he definitely talks the talk. And
Is he the only one of the four that has kids?
Yeah. Interestingly, he's the only one. He's the only one with a wife and only one with kids, apparently. The other. I mean, Kenny's dead, and Stan and Kyle appear to sort of be, in a sort of extended adolescence, where they're both online entrepreneurs or some job that I think the writers are implying isn't a real job. But yeah, Cartman's the only one with a wife. Her name is Yentl. And she appears to be a Jew by birth. But it's funny the way they sort of dress him up. Like, what is it that he's a rabbi now? It's that he's got a kippah and a talis and a suit. He's always wearing a suit. And I'm not in one right now, but I do often, I as a congregational rabbi, tend to wear a suit quite often. And my wife and I were both watching this episode going like, this hitting a little too close to home. Cartman with his glasses and his suit and his 3 kids, and he's they show he's around because he's got a beard now, but he still looks like himself. He's not quite passing as a born Jew, but he's fairly close.
I think that's really clever, right? That they didn't stick payas onto him and repainted him or recast him according to, frankly, some anti-Semitic notions of what a Jew is supposed to look like. He looks like whatever his background is. It's like a generic white American guy who converted to Judaism. In fact, Mike, I would say that when I saw Cartman with like his graying temples and this kind of like his little beard and stuff, I was thinking, hey, he looks like Mike.
I wonder, yeah. Oh no, I may have had that thought a little bit also.
You need to round out your face a little bit.
Right. Oh, don't worry, that'll happen.
Just hope he's nicer to his mom now that he's a rabbi.
Right. All right, we're gonna have to.
I just want to say one thing that came up a lot in this episode, and do a midrashic move and refer to another episode that we've recorded in the past. So Juan especially talked a lot about relinquishing your family of birth, that there's this model in the Talmud that when you convert, you cut all those ties. And I just want to make sure that our listeners aren't left with the wrong impression on that. We don't endorse that. We don't promote that. And we actually did an episode talking about converts and their families of origin. So maybe we can link that in the show notes as well. But I just wanted to point that out, that if for listeners who want to pursue that conversation, we have a beautiful episode out on that already.
Right. And yes, although certain communities do expect that is not the expectation in any of our communities. And most of the Jewish world wants you to have a good relationship with your birth parents and with your native culture and society. Yes.
And with that, we're going to have to wrap it up. I want to thank my 2 guests, or not guests, my co-hosts. I want to thank my co-hosts, Rabbi Juan Mejia, Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz. We'll get a guest again one of these days. We should see who we can welcome. And we're going to have to do another episode after part 2 of the South Park special.
I will catch up, I promise.
Excellent. And I want to thank everyone for watching and listening, and be sure to like and subscribe. We're going to try to get these out more than once every 6 months. I don't want to make any promises, but hopefully we will see you soon. And I hope everyone has a good winter, and take care.
Shalom Aleichem Malachei Yasharim Malachei